What's going on, guys? Aaron from Top Tier Gaming here, and today I am coming at you with sort of a discussion video talking about what rogue decks I think are the best in the current meta. And you know, we've had a couple of events in the recent new ban list, I want to say. Of course, we had the YCS Vegas, that was a 3v3 that we got a lot of good information from, and then just this past weekend, you know, we had a bunch of regionals going on, and I went to one. I went to the Shreveport regional where I got my first hands-on taste of the competitive meta. And it is pretty diverse, but there definitely is what you would consider the upper echelon of decks. So I want to talk about what I think the best rogue decks are in the current meta, and I'll sort of explain which decks I think are rogue and which decks I don't think are rogue, so that it's a little easier to see my train of thoughts when talking about the decks. So before we get into it, I do want to let you guys know, Discord link down below along with all of our other social media links. Also, I am trying to hit 14,000 subscribers, so if you do enjoy this Yu-Gi-Oh content, you like what you see here, feel free to like and subscribe. It really helps me out and what I do here on the channel. And without further ado, let's start talking about my top 5 rogue decks for the current meta. Getting into it, I want to talk about decks that some people might think are rogue that I'm not considering rogue. So Sword Soul's a big one. There's the tier 1 decks I'm considering to be Labyrinth, Branded, and Kashtira. Those are the tier 1 decks that everyone's sort of preparing for. And then there's a really fine line between what's tier 2-ish and what's really rogue, because some people might consider Sword Soul rogue, which I can see an argument for it. Me, I think it's one of the very few decks that sort of rides the line as a deck that's a little bit better than most rogue decks, but not quite at that tier 1 status. So Sword Soul won't be on this list, and a couple of decks like Sword Soul, I may include some honorable mentions after I get through the list, because I know a lot of people, there's so many decks that could potentially be rogue this format. But setting those aside, I'm going to talk about what decks I do think are the best right now, and I'm going to start at number 5, which is going to be Ninja. Now, Ninja got a lot of support recently. Obviously, you have some of the all-time classics. Where is my guy? 3, you know, Hanzo. Hanzo has always been the main Ninja monster, but talking about their support, they got really good support. And this card in particular, Yugioh, I think is so good for combating the current meta. Talking about Ninja, I think people have been on this deck for a couple of weeks now as just a really pretty good Kashtira counter. One of their main forms of interruption is putting your opponent's monsters face down, which has notably been one of the best ways to stop Kashtira this format. It also gets quite a few flex spots, and it has some good engine cards as well. There is one ninjutsu art card, or a couple that are crazy. This is the new one right here, Dancing Leaves. This one's really solid, just what a lot of them are playing. And then this one I really like, because I've seen people summon 5 monsters with this card by tributing Yugioh, which I think is hilarious. Yeah, it's a really cool card, and the way the deck plays, it's really unique as well, because the first turn board you'll often see is Hanzo with a couple back row, but it actually gets really far, and I really like the sort of snowball strategy and a little gets you a lot sort of theme with the deck. Will it continue to stay in my top 5? I don't know. In fact, a week ago I would have put this deck a little higher, and it's sort of been falling down for me, but I think Ninja is a solid rogue contender this format. Alright, sort of the next one I want to talk about is actually 2 decks, which, I mean, I guess this is just more bang for your buck. It's 6 decks in a top 5 list. But I'm going to rank both of these together, and that's going to be Mathmech and Marincess. I recently just took Marincess to the Shreveport Regional where I managed to get top 8. And both of these are sort of, I'm lumping them together because they're probably the 2 strongest Cyburst decks right now, quotation marks, because, you know, obviously Cyburst is a typing, but all the Cyburst decks kind of play a very similar style, where they usually either link climb or just put up a bunch of bodies, and they all have the same weaknesses, where they're weak on normal summon. Mathmech is a little bit different because of Circular. Circular puts some of the weaknesses behind, but it develops its own weaknesses with Super Factorial. Now, both of these decks are, I think, pretty solid into the format because they get so many flex spots. I'm just going to put a couple of other cards to talk about here. Mathmech, I think, is good into the format because it gets a bunch of flex spots as a very solid 1-card engine that can do a lot. It might not seem like it does a lot, but it does a lot. And then Marincess, also very solid 1-card engine, gets a lot of flex spots. And the reason I think this is good is because this meta has a lot of things you have to prepare for that are very FTK style things. Branded puts up the Gimmick Puppet, which feels like an FTK. Kashtira, if they so choose, can attempt to lock all your zones, which feels like an FTK. And decks with a lot of flex spots, like, combat this pretty well, because usually you can run cards to beat that type of thing. And then 1-card starters are also very nice for this as well. And the Cyburst decks, I think, are the first thing people think of when they think of, like, the 1-card starter decks. Math Mech in general might be a little bit stronger, but Bell is coming into the format, and if Bell or Bystials are popular, this card, which is the real claim to fame for Math Mech, without this card, Math Mech is nothing. This card is very weak to Bell and Bystial, so if those are, like, popular in the meta, Math Mech gets a lot weaker than Marincess. Marincess is much better overall. It doesn't have any glaring weaknesses besides Nibiru, but so does Math Mech. You know, both of them have a slight weakness to Nibiru. Well, I'd say Marincess has a little bit more. Super Factorial is the reason to play Math Mech. I think one of the reasons to play Marincess is actually Zelantis. This card is insane. It's absolutely bonkers. It was just winning me so many games this past weekend. This card is crazy. Of course, Marincess also have their own trap, which is another huge engine payoff for the deck, and a reason to play it is Wave. Wave isn't quite as good as Super Factorial, but it's also weak to less things, which is nice. But yeah, that's sort of my number 4 slot, is both of these Cyburst decks. I think they're both pretty powerful rogue options right now. One of the weaknesses they have would be the fact that Kashtira has a good matchup. I don't even want to say good because you get to run so many flex spots, but Arise Heart himself is pretty good versus both of these decks, so that's one thing these Cyburst decks have to sort of prepare for. The next deck I sort of want to talk about is actually Plunder Patrol. This was one I didn't know if I wanted to count this as rogue or not, because if you check my most recent, like, best deck tier list, I believe I had Plunder a little higher than, like, the rogue category. But I feel like it's definitely not been explored enough. It hasn't been getting the exact results I thought it would. So I'm going to put it in Rogue for this video. This deck just recently got Yord, which is an insane card. It, in theory, gives you a good Kashtira matchup as well. It does so much for the deck. The deck can function in whole new ways because of this card. Golden Hair's an insane card. Your field spell's insane. Like, the whole deck is just super solid. So I don't know if it's people not giving it enough try to push this deck, or it's just like people are trying it and it's just not performing how I thought it would. I'm not quite sure, but I think Plunder is actually just a really solid deck with a lot of good options, and like solid matchups in general. Like Moark's pretty good versus Branded, and of course they have a bunch of dark monsters. Is there anything like really giving this deck a weakness? It can also, I think it's one of the better decks that can play the Brave Engine. Talking about the Brave Engine a little bit, because like the Brave Engine was, that's not her name. She's not priestess. She's enchantress. Like, I figured the Brave Engine would be much more popular going into this format, and I haven't really seen it get the play I expected it to. This is one of the decks that really utilizes the Brave Engine very well. This deck, and like you see some Kashtira on it. It's a really solid deck that can play a bunch of solid Go Second engines as well. Like, you can main deck Kaijus, which are so good this format, and play a more Go Second Plunder deck. I've seen Go Second versions, Go First versions. I really think people, if they're like on the fence about playing this deck, I think they should give it a try. Like, it should be extremely solid. And I mean, at the start of this format, I didn't know if I wanted to call it Rogue or Tier 2, but I think it's definitely more roguish at this point. I definitely thought this deck would be doing a little bit more right now, but maybe again, it's just people not trying it. But I'm a big fan of Plunder, and I'm putting it as number 3 on this list. Alright, so the next deck was another deck that almost skirts the line a little bit. I don't know if I wanted to call it Rogue or, you know, a Tier 2-ish type Sword Soul deck, because, I mean, the more I think about this deck, and, you know, maybe next week I'll have a different opinion where I might consider it more Tier 2 and not really Rogue, but for now, I think it's like a solid Rogue, is Naturia. Again, maybe this deck is a little better than Rogue, because Naturia Runic is just really solid, and you see a lot of people on this deck right now. I'm just going to throw up some cards here. Yeah, so Naturia Runic, it's probably, and I don't know if I would quote myself on this currently, but I'm going to preemptively sort of say it's the best, like, Runic deck right now. I think Evil Twin Sprite is like a close second. I think Furhire Runic is also very cool and pretty impressive what it can actually do. I think Naturia plays with it maybe the best. I feel like discarding Tree off Hugin is so good. It can play the Ishizu cards. The fact that, you know, it's synchroing with the Hugins you're special summoning, and then you clear up your extra monster zone again. It can actually play all of the Runic fusions decently well, at least Gary and Hugin. Like, I feel like when I'm playing Sprite, I don't really want to play Gary, but I think Naturia Runic is like a super solid deck, and I think a lot of people are on this, so I don't want to talk about this one too much, but I feel like Naturia is definitely proving to be one of the stronger decks this format, at least as a rogue option. Like, I know it did okay at Vegas. It got a slot. I believe it got a top 16 slot. Maybe it even got more than that. Like, I don't know every single list that was at Vegas. But I'm pretty sure PAX team was running this, right? I might be wrong on that. Don't quote me on that. But yeah, Naturia Runic, definitely a solid deck. People have been trying it. It was at the Shreveport Regional, and it was doing okay. I don't think we had any top, but yeah, it was doing pretty okay. And I think Naturia Runic is proving itself to be a very strong rogue option. Alright, before we get to my number one pick, I do want to go over one or two honorable mentions, just like off the top of my head, not giving it too much thought. Springans, again, I don't know if I want to count them. I haven't seen enough of the deck, right? I don't know if I want to count them sort of in the Sword Soul category where I wouldn't put them on this list because I think they're that good, or I don't know if I want to put them on this list, but they're actually just not in the top 5, right? Like, it could go either way because I'm just not as experienced with this deck, but Springans has some really cool things like Sargas. It is just one of the craziest cards for this deck, so I do want to put this as an honorable mention. Rika, I want to do the same thing for. I want to put Rika sort of in this honorable mention category. If I were to include it, it might be higher than Ninja. It might be higher than even the Cyburst decks. But again, I haven't seen enough people really giving Rika a try again. But in theory, it's just an insane deck. I mean, it was so solid before Tier Limits came out. It's just the same amount of solid in theory. I think Rika is strong and maybe deserves to be in the Sword Soul category, where it's like above most of the rogue decks. So yeah, I might just honorable mention this one because I think it's a little too good to be on the list, but maybe it's not. Again, at the same time, we're still pretty early in this format, so nothing is so set in stone. Again, we only have 1 or 2 events, but having been to a regional early this format and seeing hands-on what the decks being played are, I did not see any Rika. And while I love the deck, I'm not sure if I would even consider it one of the strongest rogue decks right now. It's a little bit up in the air. Going on to number 1, and I don't know if this is going to be a surprise or not. This deck is so newly rejuvenated that I'm not sure if I'll rank it eventually higher than Rogue, but this deck is extremely popular right now, and it's Trap Tricks, one of the favorites of the channel. I mean, my first deck coming back into the game was Trap Tricks. I've been playing it since 2014. People who know me know I love the Trap Tricks archetype. I mean, I was playing it before hat format, before it was even really a deck. But yeah, obviously Trap Tricks got some new cards. They're all insane from the structure deck. These cards are fantastic, and just like looking over a couple of them, and of course we have Pinguicula. I call her Ping. I don't know. This deck has been popping up so much. There were so many at the Shreveport Regional. Again, I think it was a little new, so it may have had some, not recency bias, but really just people wanting to try the deck out, and a regional was a place they wanted to take it. This deck wasn't around for Vegas, so this is more like new information, because Vegas has no bearing on how good I think this deck is. But I think this is a very, very solid trap deck, and I do think Labyrinth is a tad bit better because Labyrinth really knows what it's trying to do. Trap Tricks plays a more sort of mixed approach where it's not really a trap deck so much as it is a monster deck, but it's not fully a monster deck either, like a combo deck. It's more mid-rangey, but leans on the trap side. They've always kind of been like this, but now I think it's even more so with just how many extenders they now have because of Holtea. And yeah, I think people know this deck is strong. I mean, there's a couple of people really pushing this deck as strong. A couple of people have been able to take like structure decks and do really well with them in places. Trap Tricks show a lot of promise early on, especially. It did pretty well at the Shreveport Regional. I don't think we had any top 8, but one was in the top 16 for sure, and maybe even more than that. But yeah, Trap Tricks I think are really good. I'm putting them as my number 1 slot on rogue decks right now, and it's probably a deck that I'm moving on to next because I don't have a regional top with this deck, so it's something I'm going to try to get one with. And I think it shows a lot of promise. Obviously, I played it before the support, so I don't really, to me, it never mattered how good the deck really is, but it's a deck I feel very comfortable going back to now that it did get so much support. And yeah, tell me down below what you guys think of this list. How would you order it differently? What decks did I maybe miss or misrepresent? Leave those down below. I'll be sure to read them. Again, this is more of a discussion type thing where, there's so many rogue decks. How do you fit them all into a 5-deck list, right? Like, some people are going to think that their rogue deck is the best, and fair enough. Feel free to leave your arguments down in the comments below. I'll be sure to read them. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, leave a like and subscribe. This has been Aaron from Top Tier Gaming. Bye, YouTube.